Hi and welcome. My name is Jake Bernades. I'm the field CISO Anecdotes, and this is my first venture or foray into being the actual host and not the guest of a podcast. So hopefully it works out. This is called Risking It All, and it's slightly risking it all because I go into this with very minimal ideas about what we're going to talk about. But we're going to focus a bit on some of the key things that are going on right now in the cyber news, a bit about my guests and the things that they think are their biggest risks or the biggest risks they've dealt with, and everything else in between. My first guest, and for episode number 1, is a dear personal friend of mine, and he has probably the best hair in the business. He leads GRC at Swimlane, and it's Jack Rumsey. If we can bring him on, and let's get going. Jack, welcome.
Thanks for inflating my ego. I'd be nothing without this this lettuce.
Look, if I could rock it, I would, but I can't, and that's the truth. Thank you for joining me on the first ever episode of this. But it's not the first time we've been on a podcast or webinar of some sort before. We were just joking before we came on that I've actually worked at Wistic prior to Anecdotes, and they're two of like your biggest vendors as a fanboy. So I'm just staying close to you everywhere I possibly can. Introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself, about Swimlane, about your role, about the GRC Destroyer. Here's your moment on the stage. Tell us what you got.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the first episode, Jake. I'm honored. And yes, you have gone to my favorite vendors to work with. So that shows how small of a world we live in the GRC world. But yeah, brief introduction. I'm the head of GRC at Swimlane. We're a security automation company. I've been at Swimlane for 2 years, and it's still got that startup feel. So we're a pretty agile team. I'm wearing a lot of hats as the head of GRC there, but working really closely with our security team and our CISO. So we're kind of one entity working on our security controls, and I handle the fun task of the compliance around that. So, you know, we've got a lot of new compliance obligations coming up this year, and it's been a fun journey. Briefly prior to that, kind of got my upbringing in this GRC world as an auditor. And yeah, I mean, I was almost thinking about getting out of the career when I was auditing for 5+ years, but thankful to have, met the right people and gotten into more of the decision-making, the creative role. If you could say anything's creative about risk and compliance. And then, yeah, GRC Destroyer, little side project. I like to blog about things that interest me. So they're, it's not a weekly blog at all. It's when something strikes interest. And I think I can either poke some fun at it or bring in some insights about it. I'll shoot a post out, and I'm happy to see that picking up some traction.
Between you and Troy Fine, you give me no end of entertainment with random memes, blogs, and poking fun at the industry we work in.
That's what I'm saying. Like, it was kind of a slow summer, and I was like, what would I want to write about? And I see Troy's memes all the time, and it's not just some memes. It's like the insane amount of comments that these memes get, and he brings everyone together. And I was like, that's kind of heroic for what it is in this space. Like he really is creating a culture. And so that was fun to do. I just cold DM'd him. I've never talked to that dude ever. I was like, yo, I'm a huge fan of your memes. I want to write a piece about them. And he was just like, he got back to me like that day and was like, go for it. He didn't care. He was like, yeah, just go for it.
I actually got more comments on a comment of one of Troy Fine's posts than I got on one of my own posts the other day. Like, he has this insane consumption of his articles and stuff, right? We're going to jump straight into that. I'm going to ask the first question I'm going to ask to anyone who comes on the show. What is the biggest risk you've taken in your life? Career, nothing related, anything. Just what is the biggest risk you've ever taken?
I think, man, my biggest risk was probably honestly moving out to Colorado from living in Illinois my whole life with zero game plan at all other than to go snowboarding.
It's a good plan.
And we're here 7 years later, still in Colorado, and was able to craft a life out here just from basically buying a Jeep and moving out by myself with all of my things in that Jeep with no game plan. So I'd say that's coming up. So I got to maybe take another risk. I just got married. So
I was about to say, I'm glad that Jack didn't say he just got married. That was his biggest risk. And then you went there. Congrats, by the way, for those who are listening and watching. Jack literally just got married. And he didn't do it just getting married. He traveled halfway across Europe and the world to make sure he got married in multiple countries. Impressive, dude. But yeah, let's hope that your new wife is not watching and learning about the fact that you just got married. They said it was the biggest risk ever. Let's dive into some content. So Prashant, you mentioned about, let's talk about the CrowdStrike situation. But it's one of the 3 things I picked to talk about with Jack today. I want to go 3 things that are kind of in the news right now that we can talk about and tie back to risk and our interesting topics. So one of those is NIST 2 and critical infrastructure, and I'll leave that in a sec. The second is CrowdStrike, what happened. I've got a slightly different take on it, I think, than most do. And the third is the Supreme Court overthrowing most of the SEC's finding against the SolarWinds CISO. So I think those are interesting areas. We'll start with NIST 2. I think it's an interesting one. So NIST 2 is a new European regulation applying to critical infrastructure, but that's not just like power. Like, they've included all finance, all healthcare, all telcos, most data providers, like all data centers, and then the classic like trains, planes, automobiles, and everything else in between. So it's a lot of stuff. And I think what makes it interesting is, like, when you look at what just happened with CrowdStrike, we'll come back to that. When critical infrastructure goes down, like, we all feel it, right? I think, so that's my first kind of question for you. Like, forgetting the regulation itself, it applies to critical infrastructure. Do you think we do enough to protect critical infrastructure already? Should we do more than we do for normal businesses? If so, like, what do you think we should do?
Yeah, I absolutely think that government should kind of intervene a little bit with the compliance. For what it's worth, at least having a presence in the space for, OT and critical infrastructure, because those attacks and those breaches, when you feel it as a general public, I think that's, I think that's way more gnarly than when you hear like the million stories of X company getting like 1 million records breached, and no one really cares about that. And sometimes you're looking at public companies' stock prices and they're not even going down. And it's like, it sort of creates this confusion, like, do these attacks matter? But when you look at, not to get right into the CrowdStrike thing, but when you look at when critical infrastructure goes down, that's when, it starts creating a scary picture for the world and bringing the public into kind of the risks that are happening right now in cybersecurity. So I think, NIST 2 is definitely in the right direction. Even in the US, our government is really pushing the secure software development framework right now, and focusing on creating, I guess, better development practices across, even the private industry. And I think it's a step forward. I mean, compliance is really the catalyst for everyone to get better. And when it's coming from government body, it feels a little bit more real than, the SOC 2 and ISO world that I think a lot of people live in.
No, I agree. Look, I set off from Vancouver from our H2 SKO version 2 last Thursday night, and nothing had happened. I landed in Amsterdam on the Friday, like lunchtime, turned my phone on, it like lit up with all kinds of crazy stuff going on. I was like, oh, CrowdStrike, huh, interesting. They got breached. I don't know, whatever, right? Walked through into half awake, walked into the terminal, and it was literally like absolute carnage. Like, I've never seen anything like it before. There was blue screens everywhere. There was people sleeping on the floor. There was queues and lines like I've never seen. Like, it was madness. And it made me think, I was like, so when we have like, you obviously have lots of audits, right? People come and audit you. And they'll go and say, well, patch testing, Jack, what are you doing? Like, oh, we test all patches in sandboxes and prior to pushing them, blah, 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 right? And DR, oh yeah, we do DR tests all the time. Like we've got a process we're set. But I kind of get the feeling now that we're going to have to go to a much more evidence-driven world. Like how, I don't think that's enough anymore. Because like, I'm pretty sure that Delta probably told everyone that, yeah, we test all of our patches before we push them into prod, but they clearly didn't. Like, I'm pretty sure that like the NHS in the UK, our National Health Service tells everyone they did that, but they clearly didn't. It turns out MRI scanners also have Windows and CrowdStrike on them and collapsed overnight. It's like, where do you sit on that? Do you think this is going to change how it's the biggest IT outage in history? Do you think it will change how auditors now look at something more evidence and granular than just saying, you got a process? Cool. Yeah, good.
Yeah, I hope so. Because if you look at the industry standard audits, and it can be either a bad audit firm, because there's definitely a lot of saturation in the audit firm kind of space right now. Or you can look at a quality, like a really well-regarded audit firm, just the nature of an audit, especially when it comes to testing vulnerability management or patch management controls. It's never been fully automated or evidence driven. So you can take a better sample, but there's always going to be some manufacturing of the sample or the evidence where, there might not be things in scope, because, CrowdStrike on those Windows servers might not have ever even entered the discussion to an audit. And they might have been looking at patches on a completely different, I guess, subset of servers and said, oh, you've got a really defined process over here and it looks really good. And you're able to tell us as a neutral third party a great story about that. And we're going to select whatever it be in the period. We're going to select even 100 patches and you've got the process dialed in there. But we didn't even, uncover the rock over here. And that's just, that's auditing, like, in general.
So do you think then we need to get to a point where we test somehow 100% of everything? Like, we need to go full evidence-based, test the whole lot, find a way just to make sure that you turn over every single stone so that you don't miss the mistake?
I think that would, that's a perfect world scenario. And I think if we focused our audits on, we kind of drilled more into cybersecurity and focused less on, if you look at like an ISO 27001, the controls in it, there's a lot of fluff controls. I mean, all kind of processes and controls have some importance, but in today's world, the vulnerability management, phishing, and honestly, what comes along with phishing, like also just training, that has a lot more weight, in my opinion. There's certain things that if you just kind of look at the data and the stories, there's a couple things that I think should be tested way more rigorously. And like, also that should be coming from the audit firm or like the regulatory guidance. It's like, okay, well, access reviews, vulnerability management, and training awareness, like the quality of the training. And I think those three things should be very heavily scrutinized. But another issue with kind of the audit industry, just how we approach audits, is that no one wants to fail an audit. And so
the auditor doesn't want you to fail either, right? Or else that's a problem for them too.
They've got an entire business, not to talk shit about auditing, but like they've got an entire business that's dependent on a customer relationship that, we're going to check you with scrutiny, but we're going to do it in a way where no company is 100% at vulnerability management right now. So if we went to a world where it's every single asset, we're looking at your entire asset inventory, and we are somehow, even if you could find a way to automate, like to look at every patch and see if they applied it in a certain amount of time or tested it before, that would, it'd be hard to figure out an audit process to do that. Two, 90% of companies would fail. And so that would greatly kind of shift the audit relationship. There'd have to be like, oh, it's okay to have findings over this, where in today's world, I see clean reports all the time. Like, it's not okay to have a qualified report. It rarely happens. It really does. So
maybe that's the key there, right? What I'm hearing from you is a few things, right? Firstly is you want auditing to be evidence, not result driven, right? It doesn't matter that you did a tabletop. I want to like see all the tabletop evidence that like showed me between that this thing happened. So that's the first one. I think the second is you want to be data driven audits. You want the data to be the kind of basis of what people make decisions and opinions on. I think another one in there is the concept that like, if you need to make auditors unbiased, you need to pull them out and put them on a single year cycle. Like, you can only audit this company once this year. You can't come back for another 3 to 5 years, right? Let's have them cycling more, because then that means that they've got no incentive to keep you happy because they don't care, right? They don't give a damn. You're going to churn out whatever happens. I think that kind of forced that decision. And then the great thing is that I called this risking it all. I want to talk about risk again. I think that's everyone's scared of risk, right? You look at everyone's trust center, they're all green. Like, everything's perfect and rosy. Look at everyone's ISO report. It's clean. It's unqualified. You look at like everyone's SOC report. There's like one tiny minute finding that they had to put in to make it look like it was real. Like, we don't take risks because our culture as security people is that we don't want to portray like weakness or vulnerability. The same as your point, vulnerability management. No one has a perfect sheet. Everyone's got critical findings they can't work out to patch. Like, how do you think we shift that? Because I'm a firm advocate. We need to get more transparent and be honest and have like, look, I'm not perfect. This is how good I am, but this is real. Like, how do you think we get there? Because I don't think it's happening very quickly.
Yeah. Well, the trust center concept, or just trust in general, in my head, is a sales enabler.
Yeah.
It means something, but if you have a really good strategy of how you're going to portray public trust, there's definitely a recipe to look like the perfect company. It exists. And the crazy part is, there are so many examples too. So like, you look at a good company's trust center and you're like, okay, this is what I need to focus on. And conveniently, all this stuff has technically been audited, because a lot of these controls are, in my SOC 2. A lot of these controls are in my ISO. And then, whatever, like GDPR privacy stuff. It's the trust image, I think, is about having the perfect scorecard.
Yeah.
And that's a sales enabler because of, I guess, the third-party risk management industry today. So you have to be perfect.
But wouldn't it be easier if we accepted that you weren't? Wouldn't it be easier to buy products if you knew what the flaws were and just went, you know what? I'm all right with that. Like,
perfect world scenario, we should be a lot more transparent with our weaknesses. I mean, like, there was always that argument before where it's like, oh, we shouldn't be blasting out what we're weak in because these attackers are just going to like look at that and target me. But at the same time, I don't think anyone knows the risks of their vendor. They're never going to. They're not going to in this current world we live in with the perfect scorecard, and how, I guess, the trust industry is going. So yes, I agree. We're a far ways away from getting to your world where it is actually evidence driven from like almost like a third party risk management perspective. Like, if they could see evidence and make their own opinion, that would be insane. But I feel like there needs to be like a standard audit that digs deeper. That I'm not going to say the government needs to be behind that, because that's not the role that they, in the US, that's not the role that they've taken, is governing like cybersecurity from private company to private company. They care about their vendors that they're interacting with. And that's why they, they impose FedRAMP and now secure software development framework. And they want their vendors, they want to set the example with their vendors, but there's not a regulatory or a third party entity that has enough clout, that has enough power to enforce more rigor and evidence-based testing. It just doesn't really exist right now.
And go on, sorry, finish your thought.
And I think that if we are really trying to take security seriously as an industry, that kind of body needs to be endorsed by some of the biggest names in the game. Like that endorsement of the governing body has to have buy-in from large companies. And also, like we have to get enough momentum to create almost an audit that is 100% evidence driven and does lift up all the rocks, especially on, it doesn't even have to be everything that's in the scope of a SOC 2. It needs to be vulnerability management and a couple of other areas where we go way harder.
No, I agree. It's interesting. Let's pivot because I think this is a good point to take somewhere else. So like this week, obviously, for those who are aware, the Supreme Court overturned the SEC's findings against SolarWinds in multiple cases. They dismissed all the stuff predominantly against the CISO, finding him personally liable for negligence, for mistrust, for all kinds of things, right? But the one thing they didn't overturn, they dismissed the attempt to overturn, is they said that they wrote a security policy and endorsed its specific controls. And he published that to customers and via their website publicly, which stated that they did a couple of things they didn't do. One was around access control and one was around password policies. They were things that they said they used least privilege, they didn't. And they said they had a specific password policy and they found multiple instances where it was username and password, right? So that brings us back to the trust question you're on about, that people present this perfect image because that's a sales enabler. But it's not a reality, which we know. So where do we draw that line? Like if it's you, do you want to tell people what they want to hear because the business wants to sell more Swimlane? Or like, do you want to reduce the risk in reality if you're putting something out there which might later might be proven later not to be true, and you might end up in front of the SEC and or Congress to explain why you said something which wasn't what it was?
It's a hard coin to flip. It's like, it's really dependent. I think that the criticality of the company and the size of the company and the success of the company also you almost have to think about it like you would third-party risk management, where it's like you're a new startup and you're providing a SaaS service that isn't going to affect necessarily the nation. That's one level of rigor. But CrowdStrike, one of the leading providers, or SolarWinds, I think that there needs to be a level of transparency. And I guess these access issues that you're talking about is another one of those, similar to vulnerability management. The rocks just aren't uncovered in any current audit right now.
But they're not hard to test, right? The data underpins on a transactional basis every access control, every access that happens. Every vulnerability is identified and how it flows through. Like all these things, we have line by line data that we can extract for this. So why don't we do it? Is it a time problem? Is it a process problem? Like, why don't we do it? Because we go to a place where we're driven by is this your process? Yes. Can we test it on 10 people? Yes. Is it accurate? Yes. But like 10 out of a sample of like 10,000?
Yeah. I mean, the tech exists, but for access, it's a very similar situation where they're going to get these annual audits. And let's use an example of, like, I guess, a SOC 2 where the access controls that they're testing, you're saying, well, our production is ran on AWS. So we're going to test IAM users. We're going to make sure we did an access review. We're going to make sure they have MFA. You may or may not, or it may or may not ever be asked, a good audit firm will ask this, a shitty one won't. Well, do you guys have a password manager where infrastructure shares other login credentials to like the back-end infrastructure?
Yep.
That may not even be in the audit.
It's never asked, and we've always got the answer.
I mean,
I'm always ready for the question to go, about that.
That's where you get these really gnarly, like it's these backdoor accesses where they're trusted credentials, but it's not seen, and there's not like, the compliance in a box tool isn't going to connect to that. You're going to need to do your own testing and have a good internal audit team that has integrity and says, wait, these are actually all of the areas someone can enter into the system. And it's not just AWS, and it's not just our IAM provider. And, it seems to be like not a lot of guidance between what you even need to provide in an audit for access reviews. Like, you could literally do an access review of Salesforce and submit that as audit evidence. And it's like, okay, great. I mean, like, I'm glad you're locking down your CRM, but we're actually concerned about like the service accounts, the shared credentials, and a password manager that wasn't even discussed. And so, yeah, that's like, who sets the standard for quality? Well, right now it's either the company has a lot of integrity and they set the standard themselves, or the audit firm needs to, or the governing body of the audit firms need to set that standard and say, did you uncover all the rocks? And what this already happens where, in ISO, like, you pretty much ISO audits the auditor in some cases, but I think that there's a lot of room for improvement on like the governance of how these audit firms operate, because there's many things that are missed.
Yeah, I'd agree. Prashant's asked an interesting question, which I think is worth talking about, where he says, like, if the board of directors don't accept the CISO's recommendations, how can you blame the CISO for the failures at corporate level? I think, like, I tell you what I've done, and I'll ask Jack the same question. I have always covered my back as much as humanly possible. So I will show exactly what recommendations I made. I will keep track of me showing the recommendations I made. I will keep track of me on email confirming that they do not want to accept the recommendations, and that is against my proposal, and this is why this is a bad idea. And then I consider my back covered. If anyone comes, I'm going to look, this is how many times I said this is what you should do. They chose not to do it. It's not on me. Like, keep an evidence trail is the key for me. I don't know if you've got anything different to add, Jack.
Yeah, I think it might have been the SolarWinds thing. I was reading, like, a lot of evidence in that case was actually it was dictated by email communication and internal messaging communication, where covering your back is, I mean, our CISO is on the same exact board. It's like over documenting, especially decision-making things. That's what is going to be looked at in a lawsuit. And I'm not saying from the experience, like, I've been in one of these cases in the room, but that is very essential to the CISO role. That and insurance.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. There's the independent liability insurance that most CISOs have, Prashant, as well, which I think, especially in America, is what you need if you're a proposal to open like lawsuit.
But yeah, I mean, the CISO is just one role on the C-suite. So it is a crazy, I mean, that's what we talk about, CISO burnout. And like, there's so much of that. It is a crazy role, because still, it doesn't matter how many of these attacks or breaches happen. You're in that room trying to make business decisions, and nothing bad has maybe happened yet to the company in those discussions. So like, yeah, over documenting. I'm not a CISO, but that is a really, really good advice in that role. I do it too. I mean, I do it as well. I over document because I'm like, my job is to uncover risk and figure out what our risk tolerance is.
Yeah, no, I agree. Let's pivot to the last one, which I think is probably the one that everyone's talking about right now, which is CrowdStrike. For those who don't know and are under a rock, CrowdStrike nearly brought the world to its knees, particularly critical infrastructure, on Friday. It was a logic bomb. A logic error, not logic bomb, but effectively a line of code that didn't properly calculate mathematically, which meant that it caused BSOD. For those who don't know, that's a blue screen of death. And it pretty much required everyone to do a manual update of the endpoints, bringing them back into like safe mode and removing a specific file to then reboot from it, which is a lot of work in a lot of places. Now, I've got a different take on this, and Jack, I'll listen to yours, but like our CEO, posted on LinkedIn earlier, if you want to have a look, go and look him up, but CEO of Anecdotes. But he says, look, I made a blue screen of death once, he's talking himself, and says, a lot of people have done it. Like, we're straight away blaming CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike's a very big company. Like, they've been very successful for a reason, not because they've got a terrible product or a terrible team. No one can push code into production who isn't significantly senioring. This wasn't a junior engineer, right? This was a senior person who did the final review through a rigorous process. This wasn't an accident. So it's interesting, like, how this came to be. What I found more interesting, and I'm going to flip it a lot, and I think this is probably what CrowdStrike should have done, but they didn't want to play the blame game, is shouldn't like major Fortune 500 entities be testing updates prior to pushing into prod? Like, why did Delta Airlines not test the update? Like, why did the NHS in the UK not test the update? Why did all these companies just automatically click auto update and kind of almost blow the world up and then turn around and go, well, you gave us a bad update? Yeah, maybe, but like, shouldn't we be doing more to test it? I don't know what you think. I think it's harsh. Like, I think CrowdStrike's price will recover first when you spoke about the stock market. I think more importantly, like, there's more lessons to learn from this than just, is CrowdStrike good at what they do?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I think that everyone's first thought is, well, my first thought is they're a perfect example. They're rigorously audited. They've got a ton of certifications. There's definitely a control that says they test everything before it goes into prod. How could something this catastrophic happen? Well, one, just mistakes happen. Like, they could have tested everything that last period, and then somehow, because of internal personnel or whatever, like, it could have just slipped through the cracks. If there's not enough technical controls and it's too process driven, could have slipped through the cracks. But I totally agree with your point. I don't know enough to fully agree if that is an automatic update that they had. A lot of these companies have control over.
Yeah, I don't know either, right? I'm making an assumption.
If you could choose to gate CrowdStrike's updates and test it yourself, I think that's a learning takeaway from this catastrophic event, that large critical infrastructure companies need to test updates in a test environment that are coming from their vendors. Like,
the biggest surprise that I got from this is how much stuff still runs on Windows, like new stuff. I was just shocked at how much stuff was taken down. I was like, sure, they're all on Linux. Like, I didn't expect it to be on Mac, but I expected to run on Linux. I was like, how much stuff is still on Windows even today that this could be that effective of like so much infrastructure? Like, everybody, I know lots of financial auditors in the UK couldn't audit because one of the major audit applications they use for their auditing processes went down, so they couldn't access it. Yeah, it's interesting. Prashant is determined that it's CrowdStrike's fault in the chat, but look, this is an interesting one because it divides opinion. I think there are people who will see it both ways, and it probably depends on what your career has been mainly composed of, whether it's been being the risk guys or the technical guys. Risk management is an interesting one too, right? CrowdStrike had an item, I'm sure, in their risk register of pushing like untested code into prod and what it could have done. Everyone probably had, or everyone should have had in their risk register, an item that says pushing untested vendor code into prod and what it might have done. So again, it highlights that like risk processes and risk management by itself is kind of meaningless if there's not data to support and drive it. So to your point, what you saying, like, if you can test every bit from a process perspective, did it have a review? Did it have an approval? Did it have a second review? Did it have a second approval? But if you don't really test it logically, if you don't get into the data, what are you really doing? Like, you're just ticking boxes.
Yeah. And I guess we just got to track this story because this is more just crazy. I've been in risk for too long. I'm too paranoid guy. And that'll happen when you do this for several years. It's easy for your brain to go there. But I'm like, well, just from a basic, like, public freaking out PR level, it's definitely good that all of these crazy, like when you're at the airport and you can't make a flight and all of those flight boards are blue, that's unsettling.
Yeah, I agree. I was there. It was.
That's cause for panic. So on the onset, if you say, oh, this was a mistake, this was not an attack, that's really good for the public perception to not have people freak out. I'm not saying that there's a cover up at all. That's not, but that's where my mind went. I was like, I can't imagine how much different the public perception and even my perception would be if that much damage was done because of a nation state attack. And like, if the PR cycle like immediately was like, this was probably China, that goes into like I feel like the whole world goes into a different mindset than being like, oh, this is just a thing that happens in tech. I mean, for me, this is a huge mistake. And whatever happened is just, I just really empathize with everyone who's affected. I woke up thinking my day and weekend were going to be ruined. We are on Linux, so we weren't affected at all, but we had a lot of partners and customers that were affected. And in those kind of situations, like for Swimlane, we're trying to help our customers. And in the past, we've been able to do automations that get those computers booted back up and like, push kind of like the scripts to, I guess, patch.
Yeah.
And because of this, how severe it was with the blue screen of death, we weren't even able to really help anyone through the remediation. So I just really empathize with everyone who is affected there. But I'm also really happy that it wasn't, oh, this is a nation state attack. And
yeah, man. Like, I mean, there was lots of people saying that. There was lots of people suggesting it straight away off the bat, right? And that you could attack, I don't know what their code platform is inside of CrowdStrike, but you could attack GitHub and actually edit the code base after it's been effectively pushed to prod if you can get to that level of access, or you could catch it in effectively transmission and make amends to it. There's lots of technically possible things, although people are requiring quite significant access and technical skill. But like, there's so many questions that people were asking. I think it's interesting as well because it just shows that I think society is starting to grow a more risk-conscious mindset as well. Like before, it was being whereas now it's like, oh, what happened? Like, how does it work? Like, how did it happen? I think that's positive. One last question, then we'll call it a day and we'll move on with the world. I call this risking it all. So in security, what is the one area you're willing to accept risk? When people come to you and say, Jack, can I do this? Yes or no? What's the one place you think you should be able to, you should say yes and take that gamble, roll the dice?
I feel like you asked me this because you already know what my answer is going to be, but I would say 100% it is, for me, it's third-party risk management, where are we going to spend our time doing processes and literally wasting time blasting questionnaires to third and fourth parties that, similar to my thoughts on the audit, this is not even audited. This is just literally a response in an Excel sheet or, however you blast it. Are we going to dedicate many resources to try and track every company down the chain and get a response back? And once we get those responses back, be rendered useless into what we would do with that? Because what, are we going to cancel all of these vendors? Do we have a backup plan? No, we don't. We just are checking a box. I think a lot of time and a lot of resources are wasted going down the third and fourth party. Like, not saying it's completely invalid to do some TPRM. That's not what I'm saying. But what I see is that the way that security is tested is never going to move the needle in any way, because how many questionnaires has CrowdStrike filled out?
Probably got a team for that.
I would rather that team, the problem not be that team needs to fill out a bunch of, we do this, and that maybe those people are put on the actual, security or internal audit team that's testing changes going into production. And if they have that locked down, I think TPRM, because it's such a requirement in some of these regulated industries, especially finance, I think those teams grow unproportionally to where the real issue lies, would be core security and even like a really quality internal audit team. And also something that doesn't get talked about a lot is like DevSecOps, like having the right people, security minded folks in the actual development team, because that can also at, smaller companies, that can get pushed to the wayside too, when you're just trying to build a product and stuff. And I don't want to say shift left, because that term is so overused.
Yeah, don't do that.
But yeah, like DevSecOps, not TPRM.
I think it's an interesting take. I think it's an interesting take, right? I think that there are lots of companies, my old employer, Wisty being one of them, who are trying to shift that needle and trying to get to more meaningful assessment of vendors. So like, rather than just asking, like, do you have a SOC 2? It's like, demonstrate your security posture in a way we can actually measure and take meaningful realities from, whether that's SBOM or whether that is data driven or whatever that might be. We need to get to a place where we have to test our vendors, because they're the major part of our risk right now, right? If we go historically the last few years. But we have to find a way, I think, to do it in a more meaningful way. I totally agree. Jack, I appreciate your time. It is always a pleasure to talk to you. If you want to learn more about Jack, you can look him up on LinkedIn. You can learn about Swimlane. You can ping him or read the GRC Destroyer blog. It's entertaining. You want to learn more about me, your host, again, find me on LinkedIn. You want to learn more about anecdotes and what we do in GRC automation, happy to chat. Thank you very much for being here.
Jake, one last question. Is Anecdotes a streetwear company now?
No, but we should be, shouldn't we?
Yeah, it's a pretty fly sweatshirt you have on.
We'll get you one sent out, Jack. Don't worry about it.
All right, that's why I do these. Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. And we'll call it a wrap at that. Take care, everyone. Speak to you soon.
Later.